on your tail!
Yeah, I see him! No, snap! Snap!
My friends, I'm sorry. I thought we had a shot. There's just too many of them.
But there are more of us, Poe. There are more of us.
It's the summer of 1990 and the first Gulf War has just begun in the Middle East. Initially a conflict between Iraq and Kuwait, it soon exploded into a major war that drew in a coalition of 35 nations as a result of Iraq's unsanctioned invasion. Led by the United States of America, the coalition quickly expelled Iraqi forces from Kuwait, and within a few months, the combined air and ground offensive succeeded in destroying Iraq's capacity to wage war. Although it was a relatively small localized war, the first Gulf War brought a greater degree of American involvement in the region, where its influence would have fatal consequences in future conflicts. Tensions in the region had been high for quite a while now, where the Iran-Iraq War a decade earlier in 1980 virtually bankrupted Iraq due to the losses and damage they sustained in the conflict. Likewise, many of the Middle Eastern countries were members of OPEC, and at the time, nations such as Saudi Arabia and Kuwait were overproducing their quotas for oil. Iraq understandably wasn't doing all too well economically, as they were struggling to recover from their previous war, and saw these acts as a form of economic warfare, which further degraded relations between Iraq and its neighbors. By the summer of 1990, a breakdown in diplomatic negotiations saw an increase in Iraqi military buildup on the Kuwaiti border, signaling that potential military action was a possibility. Talks between the Arab League occurred in Jeddah on the 31st of July, in an attempt to preserve peace and strive for a compromise between Iraq and Kuwait. From those talks, Iraq demanded $10 billion compensation for their lost revenue from Kuwait, which in turn responded with what can only be described as a spit in the face by offering only $500 million. Following the diplomatic dispute, Iraq immediately commenced military hostilities against Kuwait. On August 2nd of 1990, the Iraqi army invaded and occupied Kuwait, which was met with international condemnation and brought immediate economic sanctions against Iraq by members of the UN Security Council. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and US President George H.W. Bush together created an international coalition against Iraq, with members either providing financial assistance or soldiers that would be deployed into combat. On the ground, the situation was quite dire for Kuwait, whose military was relatively small compared to Iraq, who at the time had the fourth largest military in the world. Likewise, Kuwait failed to mobilize for war despite increasingly hostile actions from Iraq, so when war broke out, it was to nobody's surprise that the Kuwaiti military was caught completely off guard. Although the Kuwaitis responded quite quickly, their forces were no match against the Iraqi military, who were superior both numerically and in their quality. First entered Kuwait were Iraqi commandos who went ahead of the main force to secure key infrastructure and assault the royal residence in the hope of capturing the Emir of Kuwait. Iraq split its assaulting force into two sections, with the primary thrust targeting Kuwait City while the second thrust would attack further west to encircle the city and cut it off from the rest of the country. Within 12 hours, most of Kuwait had fallen to the Iraqi occupation forces, with limited resistance remaining within Kuwait. While this was a decisive victory for Iraq, the Emir and key government officials succeeded in escaping into neighboring Saudi Arabia. Following the conquest of Kuwait, Saddam Hussein began issuing verbal threats against the Saudis, further escalating the situation with an Iraqi invasion of Saudi Arabia becoming a likely possibility. Following the occupation of Kuwait, the international community attempted to negotiate an agreement to solve the conflict before it could escalate any further. The UN Security Council passed multiple resolutions which condemned the invasion and levied economic sanctions against Iraq along with a naval blockade in the Persian Gulf to enforce them. The US and the UK both refused to give any concessions to Iraq in order to stop their growing influence in the region. Iraq in turn proposed withdrawing forces from Kuwait if sanctions were lifted, but the US and the UK remained steadfast in their initial proposal.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. Ground forces are not engaged. This conflict started August 2nd when the dictator of Iraq invaded a small and helpless neighbor. Kuwait, a member of the Arab League and a member of the United Nations, was crushed, its people brutalized. 5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
The coalition began the conflict with an extensive air campaign that started on the 16th of January 1991, where for 42 consecutive days and nights, Iraq was basically bombed back to the Stone Age. Aircraft targeted key military and civilian infrastructure in order to destroy Iraq's capacity to wage war and to soften up Iraqi defenses before the ground campaign started. Vital military installations such as command centers and communication facilities, as well as Scud missile launchers, were a priority for the coalition, as taking these out would have had the most impact in preventing an Iraqi response and retaliation. The air campaign was largely successful, as very few losses were reported throughout the 100,000 sorties that were initiated, with only 44 out of the 75 aircraft lost as a result of Iraqi action. The Iraqi Scud missiles were also largely ineffective despite having fired 88 missiles during the entire war. Now, it wouldn't be a Middle Eastern conflict if Israel wasn't somehow involved in this, so the Jewish nation was one of the main targets of the strikes along with Saudi Arabia. While they did cause extensive property damage, casualties were minimal. Coalition air power proved decisive when the Iraqis launched an invasion of Saudi Arabia by attacking the city of Khafji on January 29, 1991. After 2 days of fighting, the Iraqis retreated, after having lost hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles along with over 1,000 casualties, as a result of attacking an enemy that had complete air supremacy. With the air campaign having crippled Iraq's ability to fight offensively, the ground portion of the campaign commenced with the primary objective of liberating Kuwait from Iraqi annexation. With diversionary fire elsewhere along the front, the main attack was launched at liberating Kuwait City, with coalition forces overrunning the poorly defended Iraqi positions. The city itself was liberated after 3 days of fighting, with especially fierce resistance occurring at Kuwait International Airport. At the airport, isolated elements of the Iraqi army continued to fight on, not because they were fanatic loyalists to Saddam Hussein, but because communications had been lost with them, so they never got the message to retreat. After 4 days, Iraqi forces had been expelled from Kuwait, although in their retreat they began a scorched earth policy, where they set afire nearly 700 oil wells. Following the expulsion of Iraqi forces from Kuwait, the coalition pursued the retreating Iraqi forces across the border, with an invasion of Iraq starting on February 24, 1991. Coalition movements were largely conducted by armored and airborne forces, with the principal goal of penetrating deep behind enemy lines in order to cut off retreating Iraqis. In the opening days, the rapid advance by coalition forces resulted in Iraqis suffering devastating losses, with thousands dead and thousands more becoming prisoners of war. After only 100 hours since the start of the ground campaign, President George H.W. Bush declared a ceasefire on February 28, stating that Kuwait had officially been liberated. Peace negotiations commenced soon after the ceasefire was announced, with the re-establishment of Kuwait as a sovereign nation and the Emir as its head of state once more. With Iraq in ruins, people were understandably a little angry at Saddam Hussein, and people began to grow more rebellious as there was no one to really stop them because the Iraqi military was virtually non-existent after the war. Uprisings started to erupt throughout Iraq, with rebellions attempting to overthrow Saddam Hussein and to have Iraq governed by a new head of state. Equally surprising, however, was the coalition's decision to have Saddam Hussein remain in power. which was likely reached in an attempt to maintain positive relations between the coalition member states. The first Gulf War was a largely forgotten conflict, although the consequences of the war would have major ramifications that impacted future events such as the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The conflict was also a short one, lasting only a few months, and it was still a major war in the Middle East that further destabilized an already volatile region.